This is John Mindorf, and I'm speaking today to Roy McClenahan, who is one of the early thread workers, I guess you would call them, in the climbing world. He was making all sorts of different types of gear back when it was really hard to find like really good quality gear. And well, let's welcome Roy McClenahan. Hi, Roy.
Hey there, John. Thanks for having me today. This should be fun.
And I remember when I first met you, you were mostly guiding. You were working with Bob Gaines, I think, mostly in Joshua Tree and a little bit in Yosemite, I think. And but I also had met you a few times before where I knew you were part of the early thread workers of Southern California and then later in Northern California. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you started making gear and what gear you were making and the way you learned about sewing machines and how to pattern things and things like that?
Everything, I would describe climbing in the 1970s as generally a DIY culture. I mean, we had Royal Robbins Basic Rockcraft. You had friends that introduced you to climbing. It was mostly what I'd call a sort of a verbal, or what do we call that? An oral or verbal tradition where things are handed down just through stories. That's pretty much how people learned how to climb in the 70s. So the reason that I started sewing was because I was poor, basically a teenager, didn't have access to some of the cool stuff I saw in the catalogs on the East Coast featuring European rucksacks and those sorts of things. So for me, there was a bit of romance to it. Yeah, you could go to REI or you could go to Sport Chalet and you could buy a pack, you could buy a rope, you could buy a harness, but certain things that weren't readily available, like chalk bags, haul bags, those kinds of things, and nicely shaped rucksacks, European rucksacks, that kind of stuff sort of made the East Coast, but we didn't really see it a lot on the West Coast. And much of what we could buy was really more in the outdoor hiking, backpacking vernacular. So boxy packs with frames, teardrop rucksacks, which were thought to be great for climbing, and which were really an icon of the era, I think, the old teardrop rucksack. You couldn't fit that much climbing gear in it. You had to throw the rope over your shoulder. So I bought a sewing machine. Actually, I asked my mother for a birthday present on my 17th birthday in 1977 for a used Singer tabletop home sewing machine so that I could make packs that I saw in catalogs. So I'm talking about the EMS catalog, Eastern Mountain Sports, which featured European stuff. European soft goods filtered only about as far as the East Coast in the mid to late 70s. And again, I'm talking Caramore, Millet, rucksacks that were built for climbers for climbing.
Yeah, I remember when people would go over to Europe, like older climbers would go over to the Chamonix and they'd come back with just like, wow, that's a sweet pack, but you couldn't really find it in the US back in the 70s. Really, some of the best gear was coming from Europe, wasn't it?
Exactly. So also, just being a teenager, we didn't have access, even if we did have access via distributorships, which we didn't, we couldn't have paid for it anyway. Right. So the idea of making your own stuff was kind of compelling. And this is the era, the mid 70s, I'm talking the era of frost-lined kits, right? Where you could make your own stuff based on pre-cut things that were sent to you with instructions.
I gave one a go. It was a hopeless mess. It was the mitts, I think, and down went all over the place. It was like really
that's fun. But well, I never really went for a frostlight kit because frankly, I couldn't afford that either. So, most of what we did was as hikers and backpackers in the mid 70s was acquire stuff for mowing lawns and washing cars. And as I sort of heard it from another climber friend of mine, we all sold our frame packs to buy hexes, stoppers, and ropes.
Nice, yeah.
Right. So that left us devoid of really packs that were useful. And a frame pack would have been completely worthless hiking gear up to the base of Tahquitz Rock in Southern California.
Yeah.
So I bought the sewing machine and already had sort of a rucksack that I pressed into service that I bought literally. Well, again, my mother bought for me for $6 in 1975, made private labeled for a company called Mountain and Air in La Cañada. Okay.
Yeah.
And that company was run by a guy who really understood the European idiom of ski touring, rucksacks, climbing, and that whole shtick. So I had a little cotton rucksack that was perfect for what I was doing, but I was always thinking of ways to making it more classic or more useful. Like at one point, Wilderness Experience was one of the local businesses out of Chatsworth in Southern California. They made a little pocket like about this big with a zipper in it. And I sewed that pocket onto the back of my rucksack just to increase capacity. And I did that with thread and needle, like this.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of thing that got me into this idea of, Mom, 17th birthday, how about a sewing machine? So for $70, I got a black Singer sewing machine. And then the other struggle was, where do you get fabrics? Well, Sport Chalet and La Cañada would sell fabric off of the yard, off of the roll, so to speak. You could get webbing, you could get fabrics, you could get taffeta, you could get Cordura, pack cloth. Those were the three main things that we worked in. And I started making...
The climbing shops actually sold fabric for you.
Yeah.
Like in the climbing shop, you'd have a hex, and then you'd also have, I'll take a couple yards of that because I'm making my own pack for today's adventure. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. I think my first speeding ticket was coming back from Sport Chalet from La Cañada to Arcadia, California. So excited to get to my sewing machine that I was speeding and got pulled over on the way back home. And I remember that I had a sort of a cross between a forest green and a lime green fabric, like the color of your cup that you just raised to your lips. I had that, and I had a blue ripstop fabric, and I was making chalk bags.
Yeah.
And I would take them out to Joshua Tree on the weekends and sell them to my friends.
Yeah, that's what I want to get into, because, when I came into the California scene in 1980, I think it was my first trip, it wasn't happening on the East Coast, but people had these really cool gear. Like you could buy a forest harness in a store, but they're really expensive, and actually they were rarely stocked. And then suddenly, there's like these home builders who are building chalk bags and gear slings and harnesses, like when we had to tie our own, water knot with 9/16 super tape webbing to connect the harness, and leg loops. And what I noticed is there's a lot of innovation happening. Basically there's a lot of, like, really the true innovation. You had the Gramichis, and you had Forrest making gear, and of course Chenard, but the stuff you really wanted actually was made by the people who were working out of their house and coming up with batches. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about how, just the community, because there was a lot of people involved who were actually making their own gear and selling it. So maybe segue into that.
The distinction I would draw is that I think Chenard and Gramici were doing cutting edge stuff.
Yeah, of course.
But in many ways, we just couldn't afford it. And again, back to what I was saying in the beginning, the DIY culture, this idea of if you can make it yourself, why not?
Yeah.
So, but talking about what wasn't available, chalk bags for sure. I mean, Victor Marcus of Strawberry Mountain Works was, I think, the first person to put a chalk bag out on the market, but they were sold and distributed locally, like in Northern California. In Southern California, you couldn't really find a chalk bag. Dolt, I believe, around 1979 started actually selling under their label chalk bags. Oh, really? But it was a very simple little tube chalk bag with no kind of break in it at all. Yeah. And Mari Gingery was one of the first people I knew that actually made chalk bags for herself and for those of us that didn't have them. And her chalk bag was pretty sophisticated. It was a fairly long tube, much longer than what chalk bags are like now. In fact, I've got a sample chalk bag of a modern chalk bag to show you. It's among the last chalk bags that I made in my shop outside of El Dorado Canyon.
Oh yeah, that's
in Boulder, and this is actual leather.
Yeah. Oh, really?
This is
wow.
And this is tapestry, made for curtains, basically.
Yeah.
And
ergonomic.
This is based pretty much, ripping off Christian Griffith's Verve design.
Oh, okay.
So this is a modern chalk bag.
Yeah.
Now I don't have an old one to show you, but an old chalk bag would have been.
I have some out in my shed, actually. I should try to find them.
This much deeper than the chalk bag in my hand.
Yeah.
So the first thing is our chalk bags, they were chunky and they were long.
Yeah.
Why? So you could get your hand in there and get chalk up all the way to your wrist for a fist crack. And so what Mari did, I don't know if she was the innovator. Victor Marcus probably was the innovator, but you had a little ring around the middle of the chalk bag so that it broke and bent a little bit as it hit your ropes. And what Mari did was she made that out of ripstop nylon and then Cordura above and Cordura below so that it really flexed.
Yeah, it's an innovation.
And then talking about draw cord closures. So here's a very simple draw cord closure where, well, actually, Christian's draw cord closure is here on the side of the bag. But you've got the old school draw cord closures that all took place here, and you would have a grommet and a place to pull. Well, Mari actually set that grommet down a little bit and put a stitch in here so that as you close to the top of the bag, it bunched up a little bit, closing off that area where the chalk would poof out.
Oh yeah, there's so many chalk bags designed.
So I think innovation sort of finds its way, form follows function. But speaking to innovation directly, and you asked about that, a lot of us were just trying to catch up. We were just trying to make a haul bag so we could get up a wall. We were just trying to have a chalk bag that wasn't a stuff sack that closed because you were clipping into the actual same string that was the closure, that sort of thing. Putting a loop on a stuff sack like this so that the closure and the clip loop were separated. That was the first thing you needed to know about how to make chalk bags, because everybody pressed into service old stuff sacks made for backpacking.
Oh yeah.
And they just clipped into the shutting loop at the top. Well, that meant every time you reached into the bag to get chalk, it was in fact trying to close on you.
Yeah.
So little innovations like the little break in the chalk bag, the thing Mari did with making the closure a little tighter by adding some fabric at the top of the little.
Really. Yeah. I mean,
small things like that helped. But in general, I think what we were just trying to do was come up with anything that worked and anything that suited our needs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why I mean, of course, Garici and the big companies were doing great stuff, and Chenard, but where the because they were doing such big productions, where the innovation, you could see it happening was in the people who are making batch and coming up to a climbing area and selling it to fund their climbing trip, because they were getting input, and so by batch, it was improving as opposed to the bigger companies which make bigger batches. But you saw that with haul bags too. I mean, because first haul bags were hard to find, and then maybe I'm interested in haul bag development, of course, because by the time I started making them, there was a lot of precedent, and then we tried to improve it even more. But the first haul bag I ever had was just a duffel bag which blew out on Half Dome. And then I borrowed one. I think we were talking about earlier, it might have been one that you made. It was in 1982. I came to the valley with no gear, and Fish was there, and he loaned me all the gear I needed to climb the South A with a Swiss climber who had the rack. But the haul bag we used, I remember just thinking, wow, this is a pro haul bag. And the only other ones you could get back then were the Forest, but they were basically hard to find. They're never in stock, and even if, quite expensive too. Maybe just talk a little bit about haul bag development, because I think you were in on a lot of that.
So that was a haul bag that the Fish made for you. And the two of us made those haul bags on an all-night push after renting a sewing machine for about a month and doing what climbers do, which is go climbing and bouldering instead of sewing. And which meant that when crunch time came, and we had about 3 days to use this sewing machine. It was an industrial walking foot sewing machine, right, with a big, powerful motor.
You remember what was it? What brand was it?
I think it was a Consew.
Consew, yeah.
Consew.
Yeah.
And I rented it from a friend of my mother's who just happened to have an industrial sewing machine. And from using the Black Singer that I'd been working on for a number of years, making chalk bags and trying to make packs, you could get a really uneven stitch. You couldn't get balanced stitches, and you couldn't use strong thread. So Russ and I rented this sewing machine and made a bunch of haul bags to go to the valley in the summer of '82. Russ of Fish Products, that is. Russ Walling. We rented that machine together.
Must see we call him these days sometimes.
That's right. Well, actually back then, and that was his nickname. So I had a little side apartment to my parents' garage where I was going to college at the time.
Yeah.
And we set up the sewing machine in that little room. And we worked all night putting stuff together. He'd previously been given a haul bag made by Dean Fidelman out of Grumichi's shop because Dean recognized Russ as having talent in the wall climbing arena, let's say. So Russ had a ballistics cloth, dark blue, as I recall it, Ruck's haul bag that the two of us used to go up the prow with in summer of 1982. And the haul bags that we sold would have been real similar to that in terms of design. So in terms of innovation, what we were looking for was fabric structure, because ballistics cloth was great for a chalk bag and a pack, but for a haul bag, ballistics cloth, which had a basket weave, as it was called, where you could like see little 4x4 sections of thread throughout the weave. It was much stronger than Cordura, but you could still blow through it. And the Horist vinyl coated nylon was really the product of choice, but no one knew how to get it.
But it's also eventually thin. Yeah, it's like, I remember those.
And it was a little thin. Yeah, it was a little thin. So in those days, we just made haul bags. I think the haul bags that you bought was a double Cordura bag, perhaps.
I can't quite remember.
That's what I remember. It was like a burgundy dark brown cloth that we'd acquired sort of secondhand through some sort of reseller.
Yeah.
And what we were aiming for was not so much innovation, but durability. So if we can't find the Forest vinyl coated nylon, we'll just take Cordura and double it up.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. So, or if we don't have the right thread or the best stitching complement, we'll just load it up with stitches. So we sort of really overpowered it with effort and with fabric. We just threw everything at it that we could to make it as burly as possible.
Yeah, I guess that's my point, is like that stuff that you guys were making was more bomber than anything you buy at the store. Plus it was cheaper, and plus you could get it in the parking lot before you're going up on a big wall.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And what Russ ultimately did that really, I think, broke ground was he came up with that heavy duty white vinyl coated nylon in the mid 80s.
28 ounce.
Which became the signature fabric for that whole era of the 80s.
Absolutely.
I mean, you looked across El Cap in the mid to late 80s and you saw white bag, white bag, white bag, white bag. So
finally you had a haul bag that would last more than 3 walls, because the ballistics ones, they'd be burnt by 3.
Exactly.
And so now you had a haul bag that would last maybe 6 or 7, and a much better investment.
So I think that was the biggest piece of innovation, was Russ tracking down the right fabric.
Yeah,
actually,
definitely.
And coming up with that white stuff rather than little.
That wasn't until a bit later, though. I mean, you're talking now about 1984, probably, when the white stuff came in. 5
or 6, even. I mean, it took a while.
Yeah, but even before that, I think, I'd love to get more into that area. But really, I'm thinking about like the 70s, because I remember Frog was out there and Fig was making a portaledge, and there's like there was just a sort of like really cool stuff that was getting made. Dick Silly would sometimes like stroll around the Joshua Tree parking lot with a strew of gear slings and chalk bags that he was trying to sell.
Sure.
And sometimes there was like even like, oh, he's got both Frog and Fish, and like on his shoulder.
So now you're talking about innovation in the distribution chain.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Well, that's a feedback.
Like, how did we get the stuff out to our public?
Yeah.
Like that, that summer of 82, when you bought a bag from Russ, we just got it out by showing up, pulling a couple things out of our rigs and showing them to people, and they bought them on the spot.
Yeah.
But Dick Silly emerged as a point of sale distributor.
Yeah.
Right. And Russ would lay stuff on Dick, and Dick would show up in the parking lot, and Russ and I would go climbing, and Dick would sell stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And he would just go climbing a little later in the day.
You could custom order too sometimes. So yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. It was like a lot of the gear that people were using to facilitate climbing was actually being sort of, just hand sewn. But the thing is, like, what I see is like you guys were getting good at like learning the professional kind of sewing with these industrial machines and finding the right fabrics. And so do you remember like a little bit about any sort of shared sort of information that was being shared back then, as far as like the best suppliers and things like that, and types of patterning.
The cross pollination happened, but you had Frog of San Diego, okay, in the early 80s. You had Russ and I sort of doing stuff before he was Fish Products. There wasn't a lot of cross pollination, as you might expect, because we were San Gabriel Valley boys, and Frog and Bruce Pottinger from Southern California, and another guy named Rich Lake out in I think more the Santa Monica area.
Yeah.
And you actually had Rich Sims of Off the Wall by the early to mid 80s.
What was he making?
Chalk bags, mostly under his Off the Wall label.
Yeah.
And Bruce Pottinger did chalk bags and did packs, but he and Ray Olson, something that I haven't historically pinned down, I believe collaborated, that Ray would make the packs and Bruce would do the Jackson Pollock type splatter work on the fabric before Ray would build them.
They're classic. Basically all my harnesses were being made by people just with, but they I was trusting the thread count and all the strength of it. But
I believe the right thread for the harness was a 92 thread, right?
Yeah. Did you make harnesses?
I did not. I eventually made some rigging harnesses in the 90s.
Okay.
But I wasn't making harnesses in the 80s to try to bridge that gap. I was still climbing on a 2-inch Swami on free climbs throughout the 80s. The few walls that I did, I had a Willens harness, or for instance, in 82, I guided Astroman. I had Navy SEALs in tow. And instead of using a harness, I just had a 2-inch webbing around my waist. And as soon as I finished the pitch, I would start getting the bag hauled and set a fixed line for one of the two guys while the other guys cleaned. And I hauled using a 3-point butt bag made by a guy who did a company called First Lead in the late 70s at a Telluride. And so that was a 3-point butt bag, something that most modern climbers don't even know about. You only used a...
Go ahead. Okay. Was his shop in Ophir Valley there?
I don't know. I don't know.
I can't remember.
But I met a good friend of mine, Jerome Carley, in 1980, whom I met when I moved up to Yosemite and Mammoth Lakes area in the spring, introduced me to the idea of this guy who did a company called First Lead. And Jerome had sewed for him. And it was a modern, as I was saying, modern climbers don't quite understand. If you just have this waist tie and you want to sit at a hanging belay, we had a thing called a butt bag, which was, a piece of fabric, sort of rectangular fabric with long loops heading out that you could clip to the anchor and then sit back in.
Yeah.
So the 3-point butt bag that I had very short loops, so that basically I wrapped it around my waist and clipped a carabiner to it, a locking carabiner, and it was almost like a harness. And I just clipped right in. And so I just hauled right off of that and used it as a harness. And when I wasn't climbing, I just wrapped it up and threw it in a little tiny stuff sack and clipped it back to my legs. So that was, a really early example of someone not wanting to go full harness, right? Yeah. I like the idea of leading a hard free climb Astroman in a 2-inch Swami, because then leg loops, forest leg loops, Willens harnesses, do you remember the leg loops tended to bind? You'd go for a high step and your leg would catch.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of us really used that 2-inch Swami all the way into the mid to late 80s because you could swing the knot to the side in a wide crack and get it out of the way. This is before Petzl harnesses, nice spongy fabric that's squished down into the rock.
Oh yeah.
So I never, long story short, I never really made harnesses because at that point I was still into the minimalism of a 2-inch.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Frog and Fish making these harnesses, making sure they use the 92 weight thread. I forget what the thread weight was for most of the stuff we sewed. It was in the 70s or 80s. Basically, we're talking about 69. Thank you. Yeah. So thread diameter 69, and then there was the 92 though for harnesses and for really heavy stuff. You're right. Those guys were making harnesses that were never tested on any kind of a rig. But it all came back to Fish's original philosophy, which is we don't care if it's pretty. We just want it to be bomber.
Yeah, he made bomber stuff. He still makes bomber stuff too. we only have another few minutes, but of course we could just chat about this for hours, really. But yeah, I think the idea is like the that those early years of climbing gear making and selling them in the parking lot. I think there was a lot. I mean, it wasn't just haul bags. It was harnesses, haul bags. It was rucksacks, of course. Yeah, and different ways of like the pockets on your rucksack made for climbing.
We were not sewing slings yet. Nobody thought about sewing slings.
No, but gear slings were full strength. A lot of
That's
people
true.
Selling full strength gear slings, and
or not full strength gear slings.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But yeah, so it's it's sort of interesting because learning how to get a sewing machine going and patterning and all that is takes a bit, and it's we
did all of that completely by the seat of our pants, John.
Yeah.
At that point in time, like back to cross pollination, nobody taught me how to make a pattern. I mean, I don't remember when I bought my first roll of pattern paper, but it was probably long after. Well, it was long after the early 80s when we were just taking stuff to the valley and selling it out of our cars.
Yeah.
I probably didn't buy pattern paper until the early 90s when I was doing production for fish products.
Mm-hmm.
Right. At that point. So, this is an interesting conversation that we should probably have again, which is where did we hook into the knowledge? Like I never took a shirt making class, right?
Yeah.
Where did we come up with the knowledge of how to pattern stuff? Yeah. Basically by taking stuff apart.
Well, Carl Copeland taught me everything I knew about sewing, like how a sewing machine worked and how to fix it and time it. But also like just the fact that you really can make anything, in two-dimensional fabric and start making three-dimensional products. And so he was quite clever in that regard. And he came out to Flagstaff and showed me how to do that. It was like 87. And then it just opened up whole new ideas, for making gear. But I guess, yeah, because actually I'm helping some people now just set up their own little sewing shops. And it's not as hard as you think, but once you do it, you have so much potential. But it's interesting that early era, when there was lots more, people who are making their own gear.
Don Peterson of, First Descent of Tissac fame, along with Royal Robbins, told me that, whom I met really in the late 1990s. And at that time, I was still doing production sewing and custom sewing. He said to me, Roy, in the 70s, doing sewing was a common avocation or vocation for climbers because there were a lot of shops like down in Wilderness Experience in Chatsworth. For instance, Mike Waugh, a really well-known climber from Southern California, very strong guy, sewed up chalk bags in the late 70s, early 80s, right out of Wilderness Experience when they weren't marketing them and handed them out in the parking lot. Right. Yeah. Hugh Burton,
shop in the world, parking lot.
Hugh Burton, one of the best wall climbers of the late 70s. John Long said he was probably the best nailer going at the time, got into sewing at that time. And he and his wife, Kathy Dermitsakis, actually ventured into making bikinis as a way to sell something a little more tony to support their climbing habit. So a lot, I think Don was right. I think lots of climbers like Alan Roberts worked for Buttermilk Mountain Works in the early 80s to finance an early trip we did to Moab when we climbed Primrose Dihedrals on Moses in early 1983. That whole trip was financed by the work he did making haul bags and computer covers for Alan Pietrasanta of Buttermilk Mountain Works. So there was a rich culture of people being involved in gear making, whether working for manufacturers, the garage makers like ourselves doing our own stuff, we were filling the gaps. Okay, no one sells a chalk bag. Forest haul bags are hard to find. That's what we did.
Yeah.
Right. But the culture of it was, we were all steeped in this idea of making climbing, right? Not only the gear, but making climbing what it was for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. We're kind of running out of time now, but that's exactly the idea. Is like that's where people like I got supplied by the homemakers and got me started on thinking about gear. So, well, just want to say appreciate you talking to me today, Roy, and we'll definitely continue this. Maybe we'll do a little bit more on the on the details of like the kind of gear you're making back then, but. For now, I think that's a good introduction to the early thread workers, 1970s of climbing in the parking lot culture.
Thanks, John. That's a good dip into the toe of the whole idea of this. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right. Well, we'll catch up with you soon.
Excellent.
Thanks, Roy.
Bye.